All right, it's 1 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. And a few people are filing in, but that's okay. So, good afternoon and welcome back to our National Pollinator Week webinar series. I'm Gabriella Garrison. I'm the Eastern Piedmont Habitat Conservation Coordinator for the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. I'm also the coordinator for this group, the North Carolina Pollinator Conservation Alliance. Thanks so much for joining us again today. If you're back from the 2 webinars earlier this week, or if this is your first webinar this week, thank you for coming and watching us. So of course, we're here to celebrate National Pollinator Week, an annual event to honor and recognize pollinator health, awareness, and conservation. Over the last 2 days, we've talked with Elsa Youngstead about carpenter bees, and yesterday we talked with John Gerwin about lepidopterans in North Carolina. So today we're going to hear from Lenny Lampel, who's going to tell us a little bit more about beneficial insects. So just a few slides before we get to Lenny's presentation. As always, microphones have been muted, so please keep your mic off and also turn off your camera if you have it on to minimize distraction. There's going to be time for Q&A after the presentation has ended. So if you have a question that comes up while Lenny is talking, just drop it in the chat in the box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll address it when he's done with his talk. And then this webinar is being recorded, and we will post it to our YouTube channel within the next several days. So you'll receive an email via Eventbrite that will tell you when the webinars have been posted, and it'll give you the link to our YouTube channel. So again, like before, just a little quick reminder on our group, the NC Pollinator Conservation Alliance. We are a partnership of over 25 agencies and organizations with interest in pollinator conservation across the state. We've been going since about 2018. And within this partnership, we have 6 committees, including plant resources, habitat assessment, research, energy, pesticide stewardship, and of course, outreach committee, which is the committee bringing you these webinars this week. We do have a website, ncpollinatoralliance.org. We're also on most social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So if you want to learn more about us, please check those out. And then this is just a representation of who our partners are. So you can see where the interests lie across the state, where government organizations, nonprofit, utilities, privately owned companies, a whole gamut of organizations. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that Lenny can start sharing his screen. And while he does that, I'm going to give you a quick background. Lenny Lampel is the Natural Resources Supervisor with Mecklenburg County Park and Recreation's Division of Nature Preserves and Natural Resources. He is the curator for the Dr. James F. Matthews Center for Biodiversity Studies and is also responsible for the management of biological assessments and inventories, the monitoring of federal and state listed rare plant species, and the coordination of various fauna and flora studies and projects. Lenny holds an MS in Environmental Studies with a concentration in Conservation Biology from Antioch University, New England, and a BA in Biology from SUNY College at Old Westbury. Lenny lives in Concord with his wife, 3 kids, and their big furry dog and cat. So without any further pause, Lenny, I'm going to hand the floor over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Gabriella. And thank you all for tuning in today. I know it's always hard to take time out of your schedules for something like this, but I appreciate the opportunity to share this presentation with you, and I'm glad that you're all here to listen. The focus will be on pollination and beyond, the importance of insects in the environment. And, the plan is I'm definitely going to talk in hopefully well under an hour, but there's a bunch of stuff I want to cover with you. So just to kind of quickly go through the overview of what I hope to cover in the next little while. Really briefly, I'm just going to talk on insect features and life cycles, insect diversity, insect ecology, insect loss and concerns, insect studies and conservation in Mecklenburg County. So, in talking about, insect ecology and the roles that they play in the natural environment, I definitely want to focus on, some of the stuff that we're doing at the local level in the Charlotte area to try and, learn about insects and help protect the places that they live and protect their populations. And of course, I want to end it on just some, insect initiatives and ways that anyone can get involved, in insect conservation and protecting these important organisms. So So much information out there on insects, and you can go on for days, just of course, on any topic, in general related to insects. But I want to start off with some real basics here. So I am going to focus just on insects. So to kind of separate that out from the rest of the world of creepy crawly organisms, insects sometimes just get lumped in with all the other invertebrates or arthropods. All these organisms are super important, and they're all doing really important things in our natural environments. But I just want to weed out the insects for today, because that's going to be the focus of this talk. So what makes them different, and of course most people know this, but just in case you don't, what makes them different from other creepy crawlies is that the insects, and these are the organisms that belong to that scientific class Insecta, all have 6 legs, 3 body parts, which is the head, thorax, abdomen. They all have 1 pair of antennae, and most insects have either 1 or 2 pairs of wings. So the roly-poly, the pill bugs, super important organisms in our natural environments, detritivores, they're playing significant roles that, help keep, the process of decomposition going, and they're also food for other organisms. Super important, but not our focus today. So we're going to be focusing, more on organisms like this, on those that have the 3 body parts, 6 legs, 2 antennae, and sometimes wings. So just on the insects. One of the things that make insects different than some of the other invertebrates and arthropods is that certain groups of insects go through this change in their life cycle from their juvenile stage to their adult stage, this metamorphosis, this changing, where they actually almost have 2 different life forms in one lifetime. So this picture kind of shows you what I mean, looking at a monarch butterfly. So, the juvenile form is a caterpillar, and it goes into a resting stage. It goes into pupa, which you can see on the bottom left, and then out comes the adult butterfly. So monarch butterflies on their own and the butterfly stage are doing important things in the environment, but then those juvenile life forms, their larvae, are also doing completely different important things in the environment. And so their relationship to other organisms around them is different than it would be for the adult butterfly. So not only are insects super important, but for some of them, they get to be super important in 2 different life forms, which is kind of cool. Definitely unique from some of the other invertebrates. So insect diversity, this is, when you're talking about, importance of these things in our natural environments, I think just looking at a pie chart like this just completely sums it up. So this pie chart represents life on Earth. And by life, I mean everything's on here, plants, animals, fungi, protozoans, bacteria, viruses, every living life form imaginable on planet Earth is in this pie chart. Insects constitute more than half of that. So 54% of all living things on this planet are insects. So here's another visual of the same kind of thing. People have their different opinions on insects. Some love them, some hate them, but you have to acknowledge, no matter how you feel about them, how significant they are to the natural processes that are happening in our natural communities, in our natural environments. We absolutely need these organisms. They make up more than half of our biomass of all living things. So, when you start talking about diversity, one of the questions we always get is, how many species are there? And it's really hard to answer that. I guess as long as you cite a source, you're correct, as long as you have something to back up what you're saying. So I'll go ahead and say a couple of numbers and I'll have a source to back that up. So I'm right. So I have to be right. But in North Carolina, we can safely say that we have more than 10,000 species of insects. And there's my source for that, the Insects of North Carolina, which was a 1938 publication, by the way. That number is probably much larger by now. In the US, we can say we have more than 86,000 described species. At least that's the source in the American Insects Handbook. Worldwide, when you start talking now, we start getting a range of numbers. We know we have more than 1 million species, and that was detailed in the evolution of the insects. But scientists and researchers, they differ, when they speculate on really how many different insects there are, and we just don't know. I mean, that's the thing that's amazing. Our knowledge on insects is still in the infancy stages. I mean, we are learning more and more constantly. But, estimates from, professional entomologists, scientists, researchers can range from 5 to 30 million species. So that's quite a range. The difference between 5 and 30 million is incredible. So that goes to show you, how much we really don't know. Because if you have that kind of gap, that means there's still a lot of information out there that we need to gather to get a greater understanding of things. We know there's a lot, but there's so much that we don't know. When you look at just the, that world of insects and you start breaking that down into a pie chart, up until this point, we always thought that, beetles constituted, the major, abundance of insects that we could find, with, 30% of our insect diversity about being, the beetles, or the, which belong to the scientific order Coleoptera. But our knowledge is like I said, is continually growing and changing. So if you look, I'll try and put my cursor there. Just to the left of the beetles is the Hymenoptera. That's the bees, the ants, the wasps, constitute 13% of that pie chart for insect diversity. But there's information that just came out within the last couple of years that parasitic wasps, so just one group of the Hymenoptera, these little tiny wasps, we knew they were very diverse. They have really intricate relationships with a lot of plant species. A lot of them form these galls, if you've ever heard of that, this kind of swelling that can appear on twigs or in leaves or anywhere on plant tissue or stems sometimes, where the young parasitic wasp larvae will grow. And other insects do this too, but we've learned that the diversity of parasitic wasps was a lot greater than what we believed. And now we think it just on their own, that group is greater than beetles. So this might be the most diverse group of insects. But just, it just blows the mind that we're constantly learning, and, what we think we know about insects can change overnight with some new research. But we do know, no matter what, we do know that they are playing very significant roles in the environment. So we need these organisms. The natural environments need these organisms. And, if you think of nature as a machine, the insects are the engine that keeps everything running. They are the greatest amount of our biomass, and they have a relationship to all the other plants and animals that are out there. So I'll just kind of try and explain that real quickly. But, even little organisms that you might never see, maybe once or twice. I was lucky to get this picture, but I can count on one hand the number of times I've ever seen a speckled sharpshooter, out in the woods of Mecklenburg County somewhere. But a lot's probably not known about this little leafhopper organism, but it has a relationship to other organisms around it, plants and animals, and it's playing a role. It has its niche in the natural environment. So when we start talking about beneficial insects, I think one of the takeaway messages, that I want you all to kind of leave with is that, they're all beneficial. All of our native insects are playing roles in the environment. And when I go through, how these things relate to each other in our natural environments, you'll see that. But they're all important. Even a little tiny thing like this, which, may seem, like it's something, not of significance. You start removing little pieces that may not seem significant. And after a while, if you remove too many of those, it becomes significant. So, these things are all important. But certainly, the major role that we know they're playing out in our natural environments, and I should say one of the major roles, is in pollination, of course. So, I think, worldwide, over 85% of our flowering plant species are pollinated by insects. That number might even be slightly higher for us here. Certainly some trees, big tall trees, canopy trees like oak trees, have produced flowers that are wind pollinated. But by far and large, most of our flowering plants rely on insects and small organisms to carry out, that pollination work, to transfer pollen from one flower to another, so that, seeds can be produced. So perfect example, and of course, the poster child for pollination might be a nice fuzzy bumblebee covered with pollen, doing its job, moving from one flower to another, transferring that pollen, and getting another generation of plants to grow. But scenes like this, this is at Latta Nature Preserve in Huntersville. This is underneath the power line. Some of this might have started with the seed mix, some of it grew in naturally, but this wouldn't keep perpetuating itself without these pollinators, without these insect pollinators to move this pollen around and help, generate new generations of plants to keep going. So we need the insects there for this. And when you have this, of course, other organisms rely on this type of habitat, rely on having, herbaceous forbs and other vegetation like this around. So extremely important role pollination is. And if insects were removed from the equation, these plants would not be able to reproduce. They would not be able to carry on. So you start losing insects, you start losing flowering plants, and then the whole system crumbles. One cool example is yucca. This is Yucca filamentosa. We see this occasionally in our area. And even more occasionally is when you can actually find it producing, those flower stalks with all those incredible white flowers. But sometimes if you look very closely at these flowers, you'll see these little tiny yucca moths. And there's 2 different species in our area that we can find. They look almost identical. And I'll roll my cursor. You can see one kind of hiding into a flower here and one sticking in over here. Just took these pictures last month, and it was really cool to stumble upon these because it was a very isolated population of yucca. But yucca is pollinated, I think, almost exclusively, or is pollinated exclusively by these yucca moths. So yucca moths need yucca, and yucca needs these yucca moths. So the females will actually visit a flower, they'll collect a bunch of pollen from an anther, they'll go to another flower, they actually kind of ball it up, they have these little tentacle-like structures on their head to hold these pollen balls, and they can detect, so if they go visit a different flower, they can tell if another female has been there to deposit pollen, and if there has been, they'll move to a different flower. One that has not been visited yet. They'll deposit that pollen onto the stamen, in which case pollination is done, and they'll lay some eggs in that flower as well. So their larvae will feed on some of those seeds as they begin to develop, but they won't eat all the seeds. So plenty of seeds will fall to the ground and, continue populations of yucca going. So, they don't harm the plant. It's a beneficial relationship, even though they're feeding on some of the seeds. But it's a great example of mutualism. The yucca moths need the yucca, and the yucca needs the yucca moths. So, relationships like this are fascinating. There's so many, and again, you can go on for hours and hours talking about all these kinds of things. But I'll just give you one more, which I think is fascinating. So, besides pollination, even in seed dispersal, insects can sometimes play a role. So, this is a great spring ephemeral woodland wildflower called bloodroot, one of our first flowers to appear locally, sometimes in late February. And that dramatic white flowers disappears, not long after it starts blooming. And what's left is, I'm trying to put my cursor over it, this little seed capsule. When that splits open, you'll see the seeds in there. And there's this fleshy structure around the seeds called an elaiosome. So this thing serves a really cool purpose. This little fleshy structure is actually a great food source for some ground-dwelling insects, mostly ants, who will feed on this, but what they'll do first is they'll actually carry the whole thing away. So they'll carry the seed away with the elaiosome attached. They can bring it back to their colony, which oftentimes is underground. And they'll eat that structure, but the seed and the seed coat is left behind, protected, oftentimes brought underneath sediment. So they are distributing seeds. They're carrying out the process of seed dispersal for the bloodroots. So again, a great relationship. Bloodroot will put that structure, has evolved to have that structure for the ants to eat, and the ants will move the seed away and feed on the structure, and then the seed will sometimes wind up in a perfect place for germination. So besides thinking about pollination and stuff like seed dispersal, I guess a really major importance and benefit of insects in our natural environments is that they provide an incredible food source. So again, thinking about that pie chart that I showed you, with the diversity, if more than half of our biomass is insects, then that becomes a very important food source for a lot of the other organisms that are out there. So this anole certainly has a mouthful with this cicada, but that's a great meal that should last it for a while. But look at these yummy beetle grubs. This is a delicacy for a lot of animals. So raccoons and opossums and a lot of our bird species will feed upon these, these protein-rich, grub meals. But these are really super important food sources. And again, here's a good example of a juvenile larval form of an insect being super important as a food source, when sometimes the adults are important in other ways. This is a picture I took last month of an American kestrel. They've severely declined in the Charlotte region in the last few decades. It's really cool when we get to see them now. It doesn't happen nearly as often as it used to. One big problem with that is just because of loss of the open, grassy, big, large fields, meadow habitat that they would depend on for hunting. So what they're feeding on is, a lot of large insects, especially like grasshoppers and crickets and katydids and big beetles and that kinds of things, and dragonflies. But they need that insect biomass to keep them going. So, incredibly beautiful, cool small raptor species that, needs an abundance of insects to be available in the environment. It relies upon them, has to have them. And then, there's other, birds, there's groups of birds that are, fall under the, classification as of neotropical migratory species. What that means is, they'll spend part of the year in, outside of this continent. They'll be down in Central and South America for the winter months. And then they come back here. Some of them are just passing through North Carolina, as they head to points further north. Others will stop here and raise their young. But this is a summer tanager that I got a picture of a couple of weeks ago, fresh back from migration. And, these dramatic, migration pathways that they follow, that cover thousands of miles, they have to stop along the way. They need to rest, they need to refuel. And, that form of, refueling involves eating insects for a lot of these birds. So neotropical migratory species, as a whole, many of them have been in decline, and there's lots of factors involved with that, especially with loss of habitat, both in their wintering grounds and in their breeding grounds as well. But, they need those insects. So if those insects aren't there, they're in major trouble. So these groups of birds, rely on there being, when they're traveling back and forth, an abundance of insects for them to feed on. And another example of this is the yellow-billed cuckoo. Got that summer tanager during spring migration and got this picture during fall migration a couple of years ago. But a beautiful bird, but the same thing, on these long journeys that they take, they need to have this insect biomass there for them to feed on. They just wouldn't make it without it. So, even for birds that aren't, going through these incredible migrations, these journeys that carry them, across continents, some of our local birds will be here, but, they rely on insects as well. So something like an eastern bluebird, and got this picture a couple of weeks ago, nesting in a natural tree cavity in one of our nature preserves. This bird is in the process of getting nest ready, going to be raising young. They need insects to feed their babies. Even our seed-eating birds, even birds that come to your bird feeders like northern cardinals and the finches, they need insects available for their young. That's what they're feeding their babies. So, even our resident birds, need large populations of insects around to feed to their young as they're developing. And there's indirect relationships as well. So even if you're not a bird that feeds on insects, here's an example of a mayfly about to get swallowed up by a fish. And then there's a picture of the osprey feeding on the fish. So, you might think, ospreys don't feed on insects, so they are really no of importance to ospreys. But if, insects are supporting populations of fish in, some degree, and ospreys need the fish, then that is a connection. So, even if it's not a direct connection, if it's not a direct food source, in ways they are all connected, all these organisms are connected together. And like I said before, you pull insects out of the equation and the whole system breaks down. So, when you talk about beneficial insects, just by being there and being a food source for many organisms, even the ones that aren't feeding on them, are benefited by having them there. And without them, like I said, it all breaks down. So decomposition, speaking of breaking down, all the dead stuff would build up in our environment if it wasn't for the decomposers out in our natural environments. So, fungus, bacteria, they get a lot of, credit for, being the major decomposers around here, and that's true, but there's a lot of insects that play a role in this as well. So this was a eastern redbat that I found dead at one of our wildlife refuges, and I moved it, and as soon as I did, these little carrion beetles came crawling out from underneath. So they were in the process of decomposing this redbat. So you need these decomposers around to start breaking down, all this dead material and recycling those nutrients back into the soil, back into the environment. So this is a dark-banded owlet moth. It belongs to a group of moths called the litter moths. And what's cool about litter moths is a lot of their caterpillars aren't feeding on the green leaves on trees and plants. They're feeding on the dead brown leaves that are on the ground. So they are decomposers. Their caterpillars are decomposing, a lot of the dead leaves and, working through the leaf litter on the ground, which is why they're called the litter moths. So super important. You might not, just sometimes you see a little brown moth and you don't think it's, anything important in the environment. But like I said, everything is playing a role. So, even if it's, in this life stage, it could be important as an adult. It's certainly a food source for bats, and, that kind of thing, or other, birds like nightjars, like whippoorwills and chuckwills widows, which are also been in decline, feed on moths and large insects at night. But the caterpillars, even in the larval stage, they're playing other significant roles by breaking down, leaf litter on the ground and, bringing nutrients back into the soil. And besides bringing nutrients into the soil, there's soil aeration, which some insects play a role in. So this is really cool. This was a picture of a periodical cicada emergence, where there was a lot of these exit holes from the cicada nymphs that had been underground for a number of years. But they're moving soil around, they're aerating soil. So things you don't even think about, roles that you don't think insects play a major role in, they're doing these things. So they're all playing roles out there in our natural environments. And they're super important, EO will, and we know that, and I've probably said it 20 times so far in this one presentation. But, again, it's just echoing the sentiment that, people who spent their whole life researching these organisms, have said. And, E.O. Wilson, the great E.O. Wilson, he's got many great quotes, but this one's certainly one of my favorites. If we were to wipe out insects alone on this planet, the rest of life and humanity with it would mostly disappear from the land within a few months. So I think, it's hard to kind of wrap our head around that. If insects weren't there, eventually natural systems would probably start to break down. But to think about how quickly that could happen, and from a guy like that, he's probably right. It's probably a true statement. It really is incredible. And sadly, what's also incredible is how fast these organisms are declining, or I should say how we're really starting to kind of catch on to that decline right now. So that's really what's happening, is I think we're starting to see, what's happening and putting a greater understanding to it. So this article came out in 2018, and it was around the time there had been a bunch of like scientific publications, peer-reviewed publications that get passed around, in the scientific community talking about insect declines. This one got a lot of attention. This was a study that was done in Germany. And they were looking at a number of their nature reserves, looking at insect biomass. They were just collecting insects in these Berlese funnels and weighing them, large quantities of insect biomass. And they did this for a 25-year period. They, from the point when they started to 25 years after, they saw a 75% decline in insect biomass. That is scarily significant. I mean, that is frightening to think that we could have lost that abundance of insects in that short period of time, relatively short period of time. And, right around that time, there was another study that came out that was published out of France that was looking at bird populations, the decline in bird populations. And they were seeing, especially for some insect-eating birds, populations declining by 2/3. Almost 70% declines in insect-eating bird species. So you see the correlation. First we're seeing the insect biomass itself declining, by significant amounts, and then we start seeing the animals that rely on these insects declining in these significant amounts. And, you know, it's terrifying. And, you know, again, this kind of stuff would get passed more around the scientific community. But it actually started getting some, you know, attention at a much broader level, which really hadn't happened before. And then you started seeing, you know, in more popular literature and, you know, online and social media, you know, you started seeing things, you know, headlines jumping out at you, you know, and of course, a lot of it's this kind of like, you know, what you would think would be sensationalized headlines to grab attention. But in this case, you know, they're just kind of going off these articles, and it really started getting people's attention. You know, and you start talking about, you know, the insect apocalypse and that kind of thing. And yeah, and people started really paying attention, which is, you know, which was fascinating. And I think this was really telling when, you know, I think it was November 2018 when this was the cover of the New York Times Magazine. And when you know, turned to that article, you know, it was titled "The Insect Apocalypse is Here, and What Does It Mean for the Rest of Life on Earth?" So, wow, to start seeing this at this level and getting, you know, the word out there, you know, was incredible. And seeing people respond, you know, so we have this awareness of what's going on at these insect declines. You know, we know how important they are. We know how beneficial they are. And now we're seeing people starting to respond to what's happening with insects, to the declines, and, you know, becoming concerned. So, you know, you hate to hear about the declines, but, you know, all of a sudden it starts giving you a little hope when it gets this level of attention, and it really starts getting people's attention. So, you know, and it was kind of cool to see people can put it, you know, in ways that anybody can understand. So when you talk about, they call it the windscreen phenomenon or the windshield phenomenon, and people just start talking, and you start thinking about, like, yeah, I remember as a kid driving through the country, and, you know, you have to use a ton of windshield wiper fluid because there'd be dead bugs splattered all over the windshield. And you realize that that just doesn't happen anymore the way it did. And so, you know, you don't have to be a scientist, you know, studying insect for 25 years to have that understanding. You can just look at your own relationship with nature, or I mean, not even with nature, just, you know, thinking back on your life and just realizing how little things like that, you know, just aren't happening anymore. And, you know, and it really gives an awareness to everybody. So this was a mural that was recently painted in London. And, you know, when we go, we're taking you all with us. And a scary thought, scary sentiment, but again, you know, seeing it now getting attention to this level and people responding is incredible. So, you know, we know again how important they are. We know that a lot of these insect populations are in steep decline. So what do we do about it? So, you know, there's agencies and organizations, you know, all over the country, all over the world that are starting to do what they can, you know, at their levels that they're working at. So, you know, what I can do is at least tell you just a little bit about what's going on in the Charlotte region, you know, what we're trying to do in Mecklenburg County. But, you know, first of all, you know, I work for, you know, Mecklenburg County Park and Recreation's Division of Nature Preserves and Natural Resources. And there's our mission statement right there. That first line, to protect the region's biodiversity. Again, when you talk about biodiversity, you're talking, you know, over half of that biodiversity is insects. So, you know, if we're protecting biodiversity, we have to be protecting about insects. We have to be thinking about insects. And third line in there, you know, talks about conserving natural communities. And, you know, that's really kind of, I guess, our way that we can best protect insects is to protect natural communities. So if we're managing natural communities, we're protecting and enhancing our biodiversity. So by natural communities, I mean, you know, that is a term for an assemblage of naturally occurring plants and animals. I mean, that's everything in a natural area. That's certain tree species and plant species and the animal and insects associates that would go along with that, you know, that assemblage. And that assemblage changes based on certain soil types or topography. But we have over 8,000 acres of nature preserves and nature preserve land in Mecklenburg County. I think we're at 20, almost, or just about 28. We're waiting to get official word on our 28th official nature preserve. But you know, what we can best do on over 8,000 acres of land with the staff that we have is to really work on keeping our nature preserves in the best quality and conditions that we can. And that takes a lot of management effort. A lot of our team spend their whole time, you know, really focused on land management work. And, this is a good example. We purchase properties or we inherit properties, and a lot of them, especially in our area, might look like this, where, it's a forest, and a lot of people might think that looks great. But if you look, my cursor can kind of go straight along this whole thick, shrubby level of vegetation, is almost all autumn olive, which was an invasive exotic species that just can take over in some of our woodlands, completely crowds out a lot of our native species. And when you start crowding out all the native species and you just have one invasive plant species that's taking over, that's greatly impacting our biodiversity. So an unmanaged site, which someone could walk through without that may have, not a trained eye for this kind of thing, and it might look great, but what we're seeing is that it's completely overtaken by invasive species, as opposed to something like this. This is a managed oak savanna at our Ladder Nature Preserve in Huntersville, an open woodland that has a great diversity of forbs, different flowering plants and grasses and that kind of thing. And with that diversity, plant diversity comes insect diversity. And, and when you have plant diversity, insect diversity, you have a diversity of other, reptiles and amphibians and, other mammals and things that, are associated with all that too. So this is the best way we can protect insect biodiversity, is to protect all biodiversity, because it's all related. You protect the habitat and you're protecting the organisms within it. And to do that, it takes invasive species control. We have a few of our staff that spend most of their time dealing with invasive species. It's a never-ending battle. Prescribed fire, our landscapes, have been burned periodically, going to times when the Native Americans were here before European contact, and, probably for hundreds of thousands of years before that, fire was a big part of our landscape. And our plants and animals are adapted to periodical fires. And a lot of the invasive species are not so much. So it's a great way to get on a larger scale invasive species out and promote good conditions for, our native plant species that are adapted to this to keep continuing, and to get that kind of diversity of flowering species and insect species as well. So some of our staff might have fun. It's certainly an interesting process, setting these large scale fires, but you can kind of see the way the ground looks charred and brown, but you come back a few months later and it's just a diversity of wildflowers and different plant species and stuff. And, of course, that's filled with insects as well. So, more my role is I'm involved with a smaller subset of our natural resources team that spends a lot of our time doing inventory monitoring work. And that's where we're kind of cataloging what we find in our managed nature preserves, as well as on certain sites where we've had some specific management practices. So looking at insects, just a couple of the groups that are easy to identify, that make sense to catalog, that we can easily kind of tell what we have. We're looking at like Lepidoptera, which would be, butterflies and moths, and the Odonata, which would be dragonflies and damselflies. So dragonflies are up to 58 species that we know of, damselflies 30 species, butterflies 101 species. When you start talking about moths, we're up to at least 950 species. And I know we have a backlog of information and photos and specimens that we've collected that we have to sort through. So we're probably, I bet, over 1,000 species right now. But moths are an incredibly diverse group and a really tough group to tackle. But again, if we really want to start getting a handle about biodiversity and understanding, what's in our nature preserves, we have to start going through this process of trying to really kind of cataloging some of these groups that might be difficult to work with, like moths. So, just to give you a couple of examples of some of our insect-related projects, we started these Mecklenburg County Moth Nights program, which did it for 10 years from 2012 to, 6 years. We're still going, but not on a monthly basis. But for those years, we were doing it monthly from March to October. We go in a different nature preserve at night and put up these sheets and black lights and just catalog what was coming in. So moths are unique because, that's the one probably group of organisms that you just go out and you turn on a light and they come to you. So for surveying purposes, it made it, easy in that sense. But, hard to, especially when you come in with a little experience in this, to really start understanding what you're looking at. There's some great resources that have been developed over that time now, which help. But I tell you, you start looking at these things and they are incredible. our insect diversity will blow your mind, especially for some of these nocturnal insects that you just don't get the opportunity to see in the daytime. But just the diversity of shapes and colors, and I could go on for hours, and I do sometimes with some of our specific moth talks. But just to give you, a sample of a few of them, just beautiful and diverse and weird-looking creatures that we find when we do these moth nights. And it's gotten a lot of attention. Since we've started doing this, they've started something called National Moth Week, where all over the country at the last week of July, people go into, again, nature preserves or parks and, do these kind of organized moth nights with different, agencies or organizations and stuff. And it's really cool. And again, it's promoting insect awareness, appreciation, and that understanding about how beneficial these things are and how important they are. And it's gotten really popular. I mean, every year National Moth Week seems to be, have more participants and more, these organized moth nights than the year before. And here's just an example of one of ours that we did at Ann Springs Close Greenway, which was down in Fort Mill, South Carolina. But again, a great group and a great opportunity for people to see things that they had never seen before. We've kind of moved a little bit. So on the left is, what we're doing with the moth sheets. We've kind of moved into moth trapping now, where we set up more like the bucket with a black light. We can leave it out overnight and, come back and, collect all the moths that we caught. And whoops, I don't know why it jumps through like that. But this is part of a study. That's Stephanie Hedrick on the left. And she's looking at moth diversity in some of our nature preserves that have been, or areas of nature preserves that have been really impacted by invasive species, and comparing them to other areas that have been less impacted. Also looking at nature preserves that are surrounded by a lot of development over others that may not be, and seeing how that affects moth diversity. So again, you open these buckets, you take out all these cool moths that you find, and we bring them back to our facility that I have to highlight, the Dr. James F. Matthews Center for Biodiversity Studies, which is at the back of the Reedy Creek Nature Center. And, that's where we can kind of spill out all this stuff and sort through it. These little blue trays are, filled with pinned moths on there that have had their wings spread open and are pinned. These will get databased and cataloged, and then they will go into our permanent zoological collection, of which I think we're at now about 2,000, or we've hit 2,000 preserved moth specimens, and we're trying to get a few specimens for every species that we document. These things are actually important. We share this information with the state, so not only are we helping our local knowledge, but we're also sharing information which helps the knowledge at the state level and beyond for some of these organisms. So this is important data. There's a lot still evolving on our knowledge and understanding these things. Their classification changes constantly. Sometimes you need to have some of these specimens to be able to really tell what species you're looking to, especially if they start taking one species and splitting it into 3 or 4 distinct species and that kind of thing, which happens a lot. This is Stephanie going through some of her small micro moths that she collected, and in doing so, finding these really tiny little hoppers, these little leaf hoppers and plant hoppers. Here's just a sample of a few of those. And I mean, just they're beautiful. These things that look like little specks until you get them under a dissecting microscope. But we're keeping all those. And so when we have time after we're done with moths, we can start moving into some of these incredible hoppers that we've collected. But again, this incredible biodiversity that we would just never know about without doing activities like this. So one other project that we've had in the past that will be cycling around again was looking at periodical cicada emergences in our area. So this is a periodical cicada. They were a little different than the cicadas that we see in the summer months, is that they stay underground for much longer periods of time, either 13 or 17 years, and then they all emerge together by the tens or hundreds of thousands, or some places even by the millions. Actually, the concentration can get so high. And it's usually 3 species that come out all at the same time. It's a fascinating thing, and it's been going on, again, for untold thousands of years, probably these little blips, these little cycles of these things coming out of the ground. But they're underground for so long, they're susceptible to so many landscape changes, development and things being thrown in the environment, pesticides, herbicides, all kinds of things. So trying to get ahead, especially in the Charlotte region where we've had so much growth, what happens between these broods of periodical cicadas emerging. are we losing these things? Are they, or is there, where they are, is that kind of diminishing? Is it shrinking? Are they expanding? I mean, are they doing okay? So we just didn't know. So, you have to kind of get a study done. This was kind of like our first attempt to really at least gauge where these things occurred by us. So we started our Cicada Watch, our Mecklenburg County Brood 19 Magic Cicada Monitoring Project. And we found some major concentrations of these things in Mecklenburg County and right outside. And those different color circles refer to, different, abundance categories. But these things last emerged in 2011 and they'll be emerging again in 2024. So again, major things have happened in 13 years. It's going to be great to kind of use this kind of baseline data to now go out and look again and see what's going on with these populations. Are they expanding? Are they shrinking? Or, have they moved at all or anything? So and talking to a reporter about these during the last emergence, they said these things are a buzzing barometer of environmental health. And I really love that statement because I've used it tons of times, like today. But it's really true. I mean, these things, are significant. They're a major food source when they emerge, but they can tell us so much about the health of our environment. So to take this time once every 13 years to study them is really important. And that's the only group for us that we get in the Charlotte area. So, Brood 10 emerged in 2021. They get a lot of attention, because they're up, by Philadelphia and DC, and they go out to Ohio and a lot of majorly populated areas. But for North Carolina, we had one big emergence in Elkin. Most of it kind of fell outside in Tennessee, beyond, our border of the Blue Ridge. But this next brood that emerges in 2024 really cuts right through the North Carolina Piedmont. So that's our big emergence, and we'll be out there. Can't wait to see those little red eyes. They're incredible insects. So, beyond projects that we've specifically designed, like our Cicada Watch or our Mecklenburg County Moth Nights, we'll participate in greater, broader citizen science efforts to help, again, build, help with that scientific understanding of what's going on with insect populations. So NABA, which is the North American Butterfly Association, holds these butterfly counts every year. There's one that's held in the Lake Norman region around Charlotte, or just north of Charlotte. And, we have a small group, and there's other groups that go out in this defined area, and we cover the same territory every year. We do it the same way, and we count all the butterflies we see for all the different species. But when this happens over a great number of years, you can really start seeing some great trend data on butterfly populations in any given area where these counts are held. So this is a great way to really try and figure out, what's going on with certain groups of, insects like butterflies that are easy to identify and catalog. Are we losing certain species? Are we seeing more of something we never saw before? Our range is changing based on climate change, or all that kind of information can be answered just by going out once a year, the same location, same time every year to collect, spend the whole day collecting butterfly data. And the butterflies cooperate. They want to be counted. So here's a hackberry emperor on one of our fingers right by its page in the book. So they love it. We did something this year. We'll also do some target species monitoring if we have to. Dusted skipper is a species of butterfly that we knew from one location in Mecklenburg County, and it hadn't been seen there for a couple of years. So this spring we did a little blitz, and we just tried to hit a few other spots where its host plants we knew there was good populations of, which is little blue stem and big blue stem. So working in power line right-of-ways and some of our Piedmont prairie sites. And we were able to find one at a location we've never documented it before. So you kind of worry when you're one population, you don't see them for a while. Have we lost this species in Mecklenburg County? But we were lucky to find one in a place we hadn't looked for them before. And it was actually one of our newer nature preserves, which we had just acquired within the last couple of years. So we had never really had the opportunity to look there. So that's, again, that's great information to have. These things are all important, and we're trying to understand our biodiversity and protect it to the greatest extent possible, and protect that habitat that these organisms live in. So just quickly to mention, there's some other stuff that we're not involved in, but for people that want to get involved in, citizen science efforts related to insects, Firefly Watch is a great thing out of the Museum of Science of Boston, I believe, coordinates this. But just going out and counting butterflies in your neighborhood and trying to get, again, those, that long-term data on what's going on with these populations. And when you have a lot of people, a lot of volunteers all over, you can't have scientists in all these places all at once, but, with volunteers becoming citizen scientists, you can. So you're just able to have these data pools that were never available before. And the same with caterpillar counts. This is out of UNC, but again, looking at caterpillars, and anyone can get involved with this, just looking at cataloging or counting caterpillars where you live. And just another cool citizen science project. Bumblebee Watch is another cool one that you can do. And for those of you that haven't worked with iNaturalist, it's such a cool app. You take a picture of something, it'll identify it for you, and more importantly, it'll put that record in there. And people are just going around taking pictures of things, and you're getting this incredible data pool that, again, was never available. So people studying a certain organism, might be studying one species of insect or maybe a family of insects, all of a sudden have access to these records that are coming in that, were never there before because we didn't have this technology. So just going out with your iPhone and putting, with the iNaturalist app and taking pictures of things can sometimes be super beneficial to scientists and researchers that are working with those groups of organisms. Monarch Watch is another great one where you can actually get tags, and you can go out if someplace, again, the Blue Ridges, sometimes you hit at the right time, will be a great area in the fall to see migrating monarchs, and you can net them and put some tags on them and then send them back on their way. And you can also, of course, create your own monarch way station by planting milkweeds and having those plants available for monarchs as they're migrating through, or even for our resident migrant monarchs that are here in the summer months. And the information about native plants and how important they are, that's almost just like what we're talking about with insect declines, how people are starting to understand and it's getting more attention. So is, just the importance of native plants and landscaping with native plants, and things like, lawns and raking leaves, leave the leaves, don't rake your leaf litter. There's insects that pupate in that leaf litter in the winter months, and people are starting to understand. It's great this information is getting out here. Social media is this wonderful tool that we never had available before. That's available now for getting this kind of information out to large numbers of people that would have probably never had the opportunity to hear this before. So of course, Xerces Society is behind this initiative. Great insect-focused organization. And then creating your wildlife habitat on your own property is something that's getting a lot more attention. And of course, North Carolina Wildlife Federation is greatly involved with efforts in this state to promote that. And that's just another thing somebody can do, just by creating good habitat and having native plantings on your property, you're benefiting insects. You're part of the solution. We can all help to save our insects. So I want to thank you all. That went on a little bit longer than I had hoped, but that was a lot of information. And again, if you're going to talk about beneficial insects, I have to tie it into what's going on with insects and what people are doing to learn about them and help them. It's all connected. And thank you. So I guess now we can go to if anyone has any questions that they put in the chat log.
Yeah, thank you, Lenny. That was so great. You did a really good job of explaining things and tying it all together to really put a focus on the ecological health and what we need to have that good health. So thank you. That was great.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So we do have some questions, and I'm just going to start at the top. And so the first one is going back to when you were talking about the yucca plant.
Yeah.
And so Elizabeth said that she has seen some beetles on her yucca that she hasn't been able to identify. They are long, leaf-shaped and black with one horizontal white stripe. Do you know what that might be?
So I naturalist that beetle. Hold on. Let me see if I can find it. Just a couple of weeks ago, I forgot the name of it. Let's see, there it is. It's the eastern leaf-footed bug. But it's, yeah, I found it on yucca flowers as well. So it does have a relationship with yucca. And again, tying right back into naturalist. So a great way when you forget all these insect names is to put them in there and you can, refer back to it later. But yeah, that's a cool insect. First time I'd ever seen it too was on those yucca flowers recently.
Yeah, and it seemed like there are so many plants. I mean, moths and butterflies aside, there are so many plants that have those really specific relationships with lots of different types of insects, like you pointed out several times.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there's countless. Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
So this next one is also about yucca. I think I'm interpreting this correctly. So when are they in bloom, and should we leave the blooms until they wilt?
Yeah, that's definitely the best thing to do. So these were in, what was the date of that one? I think it was mid to late May. We had that, I took that picture on May 24th. We actually went back a week later because we were going to try and catch some of the yucca moths, but the blooms had already dropped. So, I guess they fell out of that blooming period. I did see some yucca that I know my neighbors have some that were still in bloom well into early June, but it varies a little bit depending on where they are and site conditions and that sort of thing. But yeah, best thing to do is just leave those. I mean, those blooms as kind of short-lived as they are, but leave them up there for the duration. If you can, that would be perfect.
Okay. This next one is a good question. How can we work with our municipalities to help prevent beneficial insect loss? Right?
Yeah. It's tough. It's tough. I have a HOA that's really good with not caring if I have leaves all over my lawn through the winter months and that sort of thing. It's hard. We're breaking through those stereotypes for what homes and neighborhoods are supposed to look like, and that European lawn concept. We always love to think that's starting to break down, and people are starting to understand the importance of having plantings and that kind of thing, and leaving leaves on the ground and that sort of thing. But I don't know exactly. Depending on where you live, the answer might be different. But an organization that is greatly involved in this is North Carolina Wildlife Federation. So I would suggest reaching out to them, and they've been so involved in people, on their own properties, creating wildlife friendly habitats. They would probably have better answers for that than I would.
I would also suggest, so in addition to the Wildlife Federation, we have a program through the commission called the Green Growth Toolbox. So if you just Google NCWRC Green Growth Toolbox, it will bring up lots of information. And so just in a nutshell, our biologists work directly with local municipalities to talk about habitat loss and fragmentation, and how the rule makers can amend their ordinance language and all kinds of different things that the municipalities can do to try to minimize impact to the species and to the habitat. So that might be a good outlet as well to look into. And just as an aside, if you have an HOA that is reasonable, and I say reasonable in air quotes, there's also the possibility that we, or I'm sure that some Wildlife Federation folks too, could do presentations for HOAs. I've done lots of presentations for HOAs talking about the benefit of native plants, how they're not actually weedy, how all of these insects are really important to our ecosystem health. And I would say probably 8 times out of 10, it was impactful because they just hadn't realized all that information before. So just like Lenny did today, laid out all these things, and I'm sure everybody on this presentation learned something that they didn't know before. And it's not because you're ignorant or stupid, it's just because you didn't have access to that resource. And so I think with HOAs, that's a really good outlet too, to have some outreach so that they can learn a little bit more. Okay, so this next question, thinking about the decline of both insect and bird populations, do you think the nation needs a major effort of the creation of these pollinator corridors as a start in the right direction? With the push for solar as an alternate electrical source, I would think that solar farms would be a great place to plant for pollinators and to produce diverse habitat to help the environment. And then he thanked you for your great talk and all your efforts with what you do.
Oh, yeah, my pleasure. And yes, I absolutely agree. I mean, it is so important. There's so much that has to happen at a national level. And Gabriella, the Recovering Wildlife Act, I know I don't have the name exactly right, but that's been, I know at least at the state level, has passed the House, and or national level, I should say. But this would produce some incredible funding for at-risk species protection. And I forget the numbers. I was reading something the other day. I forget how much North Carolina gets in funding for protecting at-risk and threatened, imperiled, and endangered species, but I think it might have been somewhere between 1 and 2 million. But I think if this act passes, it would be more like 22 million. And I'm not well versed in this information, but there's things like this that could happen that can make such a difference. These things at the national level that could really benefit us being able to protect species and protect their habitat. And and that's the thing. Things are you hear these terms, umbrella species. You might have one endangered species, and you protect its habitat. There's the umbrella effect. You're protecting it for all these other species as well. So it all ties. These species all kind of tie to habitat and that kind of thing. So all we need to know about is one imperiled insect, and if that imperiled insect gets funding for its protection, you're protecting vital habitat, and you're protecting that for a whole diversity of other insects and organisms as well.
Yes, and so just to reiterate what you said, so RAWA, Recovering America's Wildlife Act, is the funding right now that is working on being pushed through. And like Lenny said, it would provide millions upon millions of dollars to our state, to every state in the country, to do lots of work like this, habitat restoration, focus on all these taxa that aren't getting the funds that they need to really restore populations. And so we in the Wildlife Commission, we've been, this RAWA has been kicking around for a really long time, and it'll get passed through the House, and then it'll get held up. So, fingers crossed that it goes through this time. But we've been strategizing for years, literally years, on how we would use all these funds and how we would allocate funds to partners like Wildlife Federation and other local governments to be able to implement some of these things that we'd like to do. And to the question about solar farms, so we actually do work quite a bit with solar developers to try to put pollinator and native vegetation on the ground. And so we do have some sites that have a lot of pollinator habitat, but I will tell you, it's been a bit of a challenge because a lot of these companies that put these farms on the ground, they're really resistant to change how they've been doing things. So up to now, they put a lot of turf grass on the ground, and they have their method, and they're so ingrained in that methodology, it's really hard to get them to shift to something that's completely different than what they've been doing for the last 20 years. So it's a work in progress, but we certainly have some sites where we're getting some habitat on the ground. So solar farms are a great corridor because they're just popping up all across the state.
Tons of potential there for sure. Absolutely.
So next question. Now, will increasing temperatures change the dispersal patterns and relationships of insects and plants? What is the effect on insect highways in the sky?
Yeah, it probably will. Again, it's hard to know how much, in different geographical areas, it'll affect things differently. For something like the Charlotte region, where we maybe don't have any kind of like more like the mountains and the coast might have some isolated, rare community types, like some certain bog habitats or precocians out at the coast. And, we have more widespread, oak hickory forests and stuff. We might not see that as much here as they would with other places where, those kind of small isolated habitats could get greatly impacted by climate change. And it's definitely affecting some of the species that are associated with those. But I will say, just even on that more broader landscape level, we definitely see changes happening. And just, again, I wish we had the time, to commit more to studies like that. We're still at the point where we're just putting names to faces. We're trying to understand our diversity of organisms that we have. And then if we can get a handle on that, then we can start looking at some of those studies into like how these populations are changing over time. But I know just in the data that we've collected over a number of years, there's, and just anecdotal, stuff that we just realized in, trying to, collect diversity data, that, there's things we're seeing that we're not seeing that much anymore. And there's definitely stuff that we're starting to see more frequently now that we weren't seeing a number of years ago. So there are subtle range changes starting to happen. And there's certainly, species kind of moving into areas that were not there before. And, moths are a good group to work with because, they are tied to certain plant species. So, you got to start thinking of it that way. If we're seeing moths that we've never had before, that kind of means something. Or if a lot of the ones we did see are dropping out, that might mean something about some, subtle vegetational differences that might be happening in our natural communities that, can kind of go unnoticed without, looking at other organisms like, moth species.
Well, it's 2:05, so we're at the end of our time and we don't have any more questions. So if you just want to take a moment to drop a note of thanks into the chat for Lenny for his great presentation today and for his time. And that wraps up our webinar series this week. So I thank everybody for joining us. I was really happy to see everybody. We had some really good questions. And in the future, if there's anything that I can do to be of assistance, I'm going to drop my email in the chat really quickly. That you can reach out. If you have any ideas for future webinars you'd like to see, please reach out. And again, thanks so much and enjoy the rest of your pollinator week.